Wrestling was first invented in prehistoric times when true cavemen tried to kill each other for some unknown reason, but there weren't any, sticks or rocks around, so they just kind of like grabbed each other and then, rolled around for a bit. And then that happened for a while. Then, the Greco-Romans, those guys, they kind of formalized it. They did a lot of wrestling, a lot of that stuff. They had even a whole Olympics. Wrestling was in there. Grab dudes, wrestle them, probably kill them in the ring. I think that's how they did it. And that was a lot of fun. People enjoyed that. And that was pretty much how wrestling was for, the next several thousand years. Skip ahead to the early, 1900s, where, up until this point, wrestling has been, kind of this death match situation, basically. And really only at this time did they kind of step away from that. But in the early 1900s, wrestling was primarily, like a circus thing. You had, state fairs, you'd have like wrestler dudes, and it'd be like these kind of weird strongman-esque, like, circus or county fair attractions. Pretty minor stuff, generally, However, around this time, slowly, wrestling began to gain prestige. There were various, regional companies dedicated to wrestling that formed. The most notable being, like Mid-South Wrestling, which was in, like, fucking Georgia and shit. Or no, well, not Georgia, that was WCW. But, like, where was Mid-South? Like, Tennessee? Right? I don't know. I don't know where Mid-South was, but they were important. They were somewhere in the South, the middle of the South, I assume, wherever the fuck that is. The aforementioned WCW, they were in Georgia, or I think at that time they were like WCCW or like whatever originally. They had a different acronym, but probably also like, I don't know, Calgary Stampede, that's in Canada. The Hart family, those guys. And of course, what became the most important, the WWF, in, the fucking Northeast, which was owned by Vince McMahon Sr. And yeah, these little territorial regions that, would broadcast television shows and do events in all of these various, regions of the country. And that's how wrestling was from, pretty much like the 50s, I guess, really, maybe even earlier. I'm not, that kind of part, I'm not really sure, the transition into the territories days. But it was like that up until the early 80s. And then this is where, what most people understand is like the modern wrestling landscape began to take shape with the establishing of the Hulkamania era, rock and wrestling connection. But yeah, basically, it was pretty much due to Hulk Hogan that wrestling became as big as it did, and that WWE, and I am a Zoomer, so I grew up with it being called WWE, so if that would, like, that's how I would refer to it, even if it's, talking about the earlier, when it was still the WWF, I still call it the WWE, because that's what's easiest for my brain, just to preempt anyone. But yeah, like, Hulk Hogan was pretty much the main dude that got wrestling into the mainstream and made WWE a national and eventually international company, as opposed to just a regional one, stuck in the cursed lands of New England. So yeah, Hulk Hogan, through his celebrity stuff, being in Rocky 3 and then a lot of other movies, Mr. Mom, good, was it Mr. Mom or Mr. Nanny? Yeah, Mr. Mom was with fucking Michael Keaton, I think. And it's Mr. Nanny with Hulk Hogan, I believe. Thunder in Paradise, I think that was a movie he did. Hulk Hogan's a very bad actor, a pretty racist man. Also, not a good guy overall, I would say. But he could cut a hell of a promo, and he was very muscular. And for these reasons, wrestling exploded in popularity in the 80s. In addition to just a lot of good wrestlers, obviously number 2 behind Hulk, he fell into the number 2 slot over the course of the 80s. Macho Man, of course, and other notable dudes, Roddy Piper, fucking Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, fucking Jake the Snake, badass, generally pretty badass dudes. There were legitimately a lot of very talented guys in wrestling at this time who were, who generally do pretty well. And whether that's, talented in the ring, like, Ricky Steamboat, although that was very much in the minority back then. You had like the Rockers, or aforementioned Ricky Steamboat. You had Bret Hart with the Hart Foundation back then. But a lot of the wrestling was, the wrestling itself was pretty simple, straightforward, just like simple slams, punch, kick, that kind of stuff. So the wrestling was not generally the most important part. It was more about the promos, the storylines, the attitudes, that kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways, it still kind of holds up. Like, the promos you can definitely appreciate. There's a million bad ones, obviously, a million terrible promo givers in the WWE. In all times, basically, but especially in the 80s, you had a lot of dudes who just didn't really know what they were doing, or were just copying Hulk Hogan, basically. The kind of Coke fueled rant style became a well-established thing. But, no one could do that particular way nearly as good as him. There were a couple different, like, schools of promo giving that people fell into. There's the Hulk Hogan style, where they just kind of yell, the Macho Man style, where they just say weird shit, and then like the Roddy Piper style, where they say weird shit and are kind of like annoying about it. That was kind of the standards. But Jake the Snake, obviously, probably the greatest promo giver just probably ever. Both in terms of in terms of historical importance, of being one of the first dudes to, give promos that like had like serious dramatic weight, like just cool biblical shit, cool like story shit, and they're also delivered super well, because he's a very scary dude. Because he's like a super fucked up drug addict at this time, as were, that's the other thing, another important thing to mention, a lot of drugs and steroids going on in the WWE at this time. A lot of steroids. Most of the locker room was on steroids or, some other kind of illegal or at the very least frowned upon, substance to increase muscle mass or whatever. And also a lot of drugs, a lot of cocaine, a lot of fucking weed, but the horrors of marijuana, obviously. Prostitutes, getting drunk all the time, perform wrestling matches drunk or on coke, doing promos on coke, as I mentioned before, that kind of stuff. So in many ways, the WWE in the 80s was kind of run a lot like the carnival style of how wrestling used to be. But that time of reckoning eventually came. The unabashed use of steroids and that kind of stuff eventually caught up to Vince with the big steroid trial scandal in was it in like 90, 91, 92, early first few years of the 90s, where Vince McMahon Jr., I forgot to mention him, taking over his dad's company in the early 80s, I guess, and that is, he's the one who, pushed Hulk Hogan and brought WWE to a national company. Probably should have mentioned that. Fairly important guy in history of wrestling is Vince McMahon. But yeah, he got sent to trial for a judge, and it's like, hey man, what's the deal with all these steroids? And it's basically accepted now that, like, yeah, Vince encouraged dudes to do steroids because, I mean, A, it sells, and B, Vince McMahon has a fucking, like, buff dude fetish, including for himself, because, he kept in very, very much shape, even as an old-ass dude. But, yeah, he's into that. He likes it. He has very much a bias towards big, strong dudes. And yeah, he either encouraged or, subtly was just like, hey, you gotta bulk up, you just gotta, and I've heard stories of dudes talking about, like, yeah, they had doctors who would just, like, go to the wrestlers and be like, all right, we got all these drugs, just take what you want, we got these for you, just take them. So yeah, despite this, Vince McMahon is found innocent, and escapes with his business intact, but now with still a very watchful eye, because, like, the fact that the wrestlers are using steroids is known. Just Vince McMahon's guilt in supplying them or encouraging their use is not proven in court, even though it's basically accepted as true at this point. But allegedly, I guess. So after this, a lot of stuff happens. We enter the dark age of modern wrestling. Reverts back to the death match of Greco-Roman wrestling. Yeah, with harsher security checks, safety checks, wellness checks. That's not really the other two. Mostly just wellness checks. Was looking for the word. Steroid use being more harshly stopped. Hulk Hogan stopped taking steroids. You could if you compare Hulk Hogan from like 1988 or something to Hulk Hogan of 1992, 93, like, he shrinks like an entire size. Like, he's about half the man he used to be. And the same is true for many wrestlers. A lot of them quit or jump ship to other companies, either WCW. A lot of them leave for Japan, New Japan Pro Wrestling, and other wrestling companies in Japan, because at that time Japanese wrestling was popping off like probably more than American wrestling really was, because it was, entering its downturn. The initial hype of the Hulkamania era, wrestling being everywhere on TV and stuff, had started to go away by the early 90s, especially after the steroids trial brought a lot of negative attention to wrestling. So it just started getting a lot less general viewership. Attendance to their big events was down. Pay-per-view buys were down. Business all around was bad for the WWE. And yeah, they lost big names like Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, fucking Roddy Piper, Macho Man. Well, Macho Man was like still with the company until '94, but Vince McMahon was just like, "You're too old. Nobody likes you," even though everybody still likes Macho Man, and he then went on to continue to be liked in WCW for years afterward. But Macho Man. So yeah, new wrestling stars had to be made because the old ones left, or just kind of stopped being popular. Or a lot of them were also getting like too fucked up to continue wrestling, because the wrestling in the 80s also, everybody got like hip injuries or neck injuries that ended their careers very quickly, because it was not very safe back then. Even less safe than even in like the fucking late 90s and 2000s with the Attitude Era, doing hardcore wrestling and stuff. I think it's because the wrestling mats were harder. Like, did a lot of bumps on your ass or on your back, and it would just fuck up your hips or your back or your neck. So that's why a lot of old wrestlers are like super fucked up and immobile now. But that's probably the fate that awaits all like long-term wrestlers, just because it's a hard fucking sport on your body. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, new stars had to be made. So the aforementioned Bret Hart, formerly a tag team competitor, had been singles since like the early 90s, been a singles competitor. He rose through the ranks to become, world champion, the face of the early new generation, as the era is called in wrestling historiography, the new generation era. Bret Hart was like the face of it for like the early period, from like 91-ish, 94 to 94. Fucking, were there even other like good ones? I mean, Yokozuna was the big heel. He's just a big fat Samoan guy that they pretended was Japanese. He's like, extremely morbidly obese. And then he sits on you, and that's his finisher. You got Owen Hart. Shawn Michaels also became a singles competitor at this time. Although he wasn't, competing for like the championship and shit yet. But he was an important dude. Man, I don't even know. I watch a lot of OSW, and that's my main exposure to like week by week old wrestling shit. But I can't even think of like new gen wrestlers, because like they're also like any like decent ones. Like I can think of fucking Atom Bomb and goddamn Max Moon. That is one of the other main reasons why business downturned so much in the New Generation era, is because it very much, like, wrestling in the Hulkamania era was very much for kids. But it was not like that stupid, because there would generally still be like characters and like Rowdy Roddy Piper. His whole thing isn't just that he's Scottish. He's like a crazy Scottish dude who is, he's like a wacky man. Fucking Macho Man's thing isn't just that he's buff. He's like a weird, crazy guy he'll yell at you. A lot of characters in wrestling in the 80s are just like crazy dudes, which is, that's always fun. In the New Gen era, wrestling became overwhelmed with dudes like Duke the Dumpster Droese, who is a wrestling trash man. Isaac Yankem, DDS. He's an evil dentist with fucked up teeth, and also the wrestler Kane. Also now like the mayor of a town, I think. Abe Knuckleball Schwartz, who is a baseball player, but also a wrestler who paints a baseball on his face. Doink the Wrestling Clown, who initially actually was like a cool, like, heel it clown kinda, who had like really badass music actually. But then he just became like, he throws a pie in your face and goes like, ha ha. And that was him as like a nice guy. That was him as a face. He just throws a pie in your face. This was the majority of the roster at the time, and any like decent dudes like Bret Hart, Owen Hart, or Shawn Michaels were, Razor Ramon. That's probably the glaring one. These guys were rarer, and really only in the main event. So yeah, consistently downturn in viewership. People like it less. Sells less. Not making as much money. And then Vince is like, all right. Vince McMahon's like, all right. This Bret Hart guy, things really ain't working out. Really not working out. With him as, the head baby face of the brand. We need a new guy. We need a new guy to lead the new generation. Because Bret Hart, he is an old dude. He was wrestling in the Hulkamania era just as a tag team. So he's like, all right, we got to get some fresh blood in. We got this guy, Kevin Nash. Ring name in WWE is Diesel. Big guy. That which makes a Mack truck go. Diesel. So, he's this giant, like, fucking 6'7" ass, giant ass man. He's a very strong, buff ass dude. He's got, cocky swagger. They introduced him initially as Shawn Michaels' like bodyguard, and quickly became like taken a lot more seriously than Shawn Michaels. And Vince is like, all right, this is the guy that we want to be the new face. He becomes the new main guy. In modern equivalent, if you don't understand, he's the new John Cena. He's the new Hulk Hogan. What he's trying to do. That does not go well. Diesel becomes WWE champion for basically, I think it's like almost an entire year, or maybe there was like a couple points where it was like split up briefly. But for basically the entirety of, I think it was 95. Diesel is the WWE champion. And this is the worst year in WWE history in terms of sales and critical reception of their shows. Almost crashing the company again. Basically crashing the company. It does not go well. Not a good time. Now, the other major wrestling company in America that I neglected to mention in depth was WCW, World Championship Wrestling, based in Atlanta, Georgia. Owned by television mogul Ted Turner, owner of, like TBS, TNT, a lot of T-based channels that, he owns. And WCW was safe from, kind of the wrestling industry downturn after, the Hulkamania era, is because Ted Turner is a huge wrestling mark, big nerd. So he's just willing to eat the costs. And he's just like, yeah, I mean, I love wrestling. I just want wrestling on my television network. Saying all this in like a hick accent. So, fuck it, I'll pay it. I don't care. I don't care if there's a more profitable time slot that I could be running. Just, wrestling. And this is where a lot of WWE's older talent goes. Hulk Hogan went to WCW and was there until WCW closed, from 95 or whatever on. Macho Man went there also. Bret Hart went there later. Fucking Ultimate Warrior went there. The Ultimate, don't talk about the Ultimate Warrior in WCW. Jake the Snake went there and then was drunk in his matches, and it was fucked up and sad. But yeah, and during this time, I think WCW was slightly more successful during the New Gen era. They had a lot of very talented dudes in the undercard. They had, the cruiserweight stuff like Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, a lot of dudes from down in Mexico like La Parca, fucking Juventud Guerrera, that kind of stuff. They had technical wrestler dudes like Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit. I don't think Lance Storm was there at this time, but I kind of like him even though he's boring. Perry Saturn, I guess. And then the main events of WCW would mostly be the Hulk Hogan style, older talent, and Ric Flair, who is always awesome. And I did mention him. Ric Flair is probably arguably the best wrestler ever. Not my personal favorite, but arguably the best. And probably second greatest promo guy of all time after Jake the Snake. So, yeah. There was also a lot of the aforementioned stupid kiddie bullshit in WCW. Plenty of that. But it also had, just generally more good stuff in it than WWE did. So that's why it was more successful. Now, skipping forward a few years into the later 90s, both companies are in need of a shakeup. Things have got to change. There's a radical new direction that needs to be gone in. And they're going to do it. WWE becomes increasingly run by a group known as The Clique, which is wrestlers Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, aka Diesel, Scott Hall, aka Razor Ramon, and fucking Triple H, Paul Levesque. These dudes run the WWE behind the scenes like a shadow government. If you know this. At this point in time, I think it's 96, 97 is when the Montreal Screwjob happened. Shawn Michaels challenging for the WWE Championship makes Bret Hart lose, cheats him, bad stuff happens. It's not a good time for anybody. And then also Scott Hall and Kevin Nash quit WWE and go on WCW. And they're the outsiders. They're like these weird dudes who it's like, hey, they're coming. It's these dudes from the WWE coming into WCW, and that's how they played it. Like that's what was happening, even though they're just normal wrestlers under contract. And so they just like fuck shit up. They would just like fuck up people's matches. Like they just run in, beat people up, like tear up equipment, just be a nuisance basically. And this kind of thing had never been done or seen in wrestling before. People were like, whoa. Like people thought this was real, even though at the time people generally knew wrestling was fake. But people thought that this, the angle of them being, like actual dudes running in and, fucking shit up, and that being a legitimate event that happens, people believed that at the time, or at least some people did. Which isn't necessarily to testify to its believability IRL, but just that it had never been done before. Doesn't really logically make a whole lot of sense, but so yeah, they fucked up stuff in WCW for a while, and then they're like, hey, we have a third guy who is our buddy, and we are going to reveal him. So everyone's like, whoa, who's the third man? Who is the third outsider? So everyone's freaking out. And then it's revealed that it is Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan is evil now. And that was the craziest shit anybody had ever seen. People threw garbage in the ring at him. That's why WCW is awesome, because people threw garbage and shit and like ran into the ring all the time, because it's a bunch of like drunk hicks, even more so than WWE, which like it's now drunk hicks a lot of the time because it's the only like big wrestling company in America anymore. But at the time, WCW had the market cornered on drunk hicks, which are the best wrestling fans, obviously. So yeah, this was the beginning of the NWO, the New World Order, and they basically ramped up, the fucking up operations from what Hall and Nash did by themselves. They basically took over the company. They had like their own pay-per-view at one point. It was a big ass thing. Like basically the entire company eventually revolved around the NWO, and like everyone was a part of some fucking faction of the NWO. It split into like multiple ways. It got out of control. It definitely got out of control. But in its original form, as just dudes fucking shit up, like bribing the higher ups of the company, doing corruption, like this kind of stuff was extremely popular. People had never seen anything like it, and it was very, very engaging in a way that few things at that time were in wrestling. So WCW exploded in popularity, shot past WWE in terms of the ratings of their weekly shows. And so WWE was like, well, fuck, bro. Fuck, dude, this WCW. What are we gonna do? What are we gonna do about this? And so they get Shawn Michaels and Triple H, and they're like, all right, you guys are gonna be in a tag team. You're gonna make like poopy dick jokes. You're gonna like, say suck our dicks, that kind of stuff. And that's basically the direction we're gonna take the whole company. And that tag team was known as Degeneration X. And that's basically WWE became, poopy dick jokes. This very like lowbrow, comedic stuff. Whole lot of, naked girls, hot, sexy babes, and they're doing wrestling matches, the brown panties match, that kind of stuff. But also just a lot of good storylines, good wrestling. This is where, most of wrestling's, modern, like, most popular dudes, obviously, The Rock, Steve Austin, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, obviously. That wasn't funny. I apologize for that one. This is where they came from. So even though a larger part than most people want to admit of the Attitude Era was just really stupid and in pretty poor taste a lot of the time, there was definitely a lot of shit to be invested in and excited about in wrestling, which is why it quickly became, the hottest period in wrestling history. And so, yeah, for a while, WWE and WCW were locked in a heated competition. The Monday Night Wars is what it's called. Fighting for views, trying to pull crazier stunts, trying to fucking get the people watching, get the butts in the seats. And yeah, like I said, it was generally considered the peak period in all of wrestling to this day. So, let that speak to its effectiveness. Eventually, though, after a few years, getting into 99 and 2000, WWE started to very clearly pull ahead in the ratings. WCW had brought in acclaimed writer Vince Russo onto their staff. Now, main thing, for those not a wrestling fan, main thing to know about Vince Russo, kind of a dipshit. Formerly WWE writer, in charge of many of the aforementioned extremely stupid and tasteless things done in WWE, along with some of the good things. Vince Russo doesn't have zero good ideas, just like a very small amount, and then a lot of extremely bad ideas. And in his time in WCW, it was mostly the latter. The NWO situation spiraled out of control, very much so, until they basically had to reboot the entire WCW storyline into two new factions that were at war with each other all the time, and I don't know. The last few years of WCW's existence became a shit show. And then finally in, I think it was 2001, right? WCW closed its doors because Turner Media or whatever, Ted Turner's company, got bought out. So he was no longer, the patron of WCW, and nobody else wanted to buy them or pick their fucking show up for a time slot. So they closed, and WWE bought them, bringing a lot of the backstage talent, Eric Bischoff, onto the show, doing stuff. A lot of the wrestlers. There was a big invasion angle where it's like, oh, WCW is invading the WWE. But yeah, dudes like Booker T, dudes like, I think that is where Chris Benoit came from. He came in with WCW, right? And ECW as well. I didn't really mention them. They were like a smaller extreme wrestling where they would do, like really dangerous shit that fucked up their wrestlers, which is why like half of their former wrestlers are dead now, and the other half are like hoveled old people at like 45. But yeah, they also went out of business at around the same time and were bought by WWE, and they were part of the WCW invasion. And Rob Van Dam was one of the other dudes that came out of that. He was with them. Yeah, and then WWE was the only major wrestling company in America, and they were like, whoa. And then they kind of basically got complacent. Started a lot of the storylines post the Attitude Era, in the Ruthless Aggression Era, as it is called. Based on John Cena quote, Baby John Cena. I kind of think it's pretty stupid from what I've seen of it. I mean, I haven't like gone through, week by week watching the stuff, but from what I've seen of this era of wrestling, kind of seems pretty bad. There's a lot of the lowbrow stuff seems to take even more center stage, and there's less more compelling drama stuff like with Mankind or just good stuff, not enough good stuff, a lot of just dumb stuff, a lot of bras and panties matches, a lot of, nonsense, hugamaloo, I don't even know what's going on with that anymore. Late 2000s, we see the rise of John Cena. He becomes the new face of the WWE after kind of losing it for a while, like after Stone Cold left. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned Stone Cold basically became the face of the company, and The Rock. It was kind of like a diarchy thing. But after they left in like the mid 2000s, the company was a little bit rudderless. You could argue like Triple H, I guess, even though he wasn't a face. With Evolution and stuff, especially being kind of the primary thing at this time. But yeah, it wasn't until a few years later where John Cena became, undisputably the main dude. And it was also this time that, like, wrestling fans started to hate him. Because his prior gimmick was a goofy white rapper from Massachusetts. And I love it. I love white rapper John Cena. Him doing it at WrestleMania 2 WrestleManias ago was amazing. Yeah, he transformed into like this motivational t-shirt wearing, like, never give up, hustle, loyalty, respect, John Cena, respect the troops. John Cena, baby. You probably know John Cena's deal. So like that kind of like goofy character change alongside with the booking being pretty bad. John Cena just beating everyone all the time in a Superman-esque way where he'll get like beat to shit like in the middle of a match, and then he'll do his finisher and win. That kind of stuff. Or where like they'll build up a heel real scary, and then John Cena will beat him, and then that's it. And the heel doesn't, have anywhere to go from there. So, yeah, that kind of made wrestling into more of a kid-friendly thing again, having this more child-friendly face in charge of the company, which leads into the PG era, which I forget when they went back to PG. Was it like 2010, 2011? Not sure. But late 2000s, early 2010s, WWE again makes a marked shift towards a younger demographic, because they're like, all right, the 20 to 30-year-old like beer drinking male demographic has gradually left the fandom. They don't really care about wrestling anymore. They're older. They got like families now. So we got to go back to kids. Kids is the evergreen market for wrestling. Kids and like wrestling marks who, you can't reliably sell to, because they're like weird nerds, like myself. So yeah, it's not nearly as kitschy, obviously, as like the new gen era, but there is just a lot of like dumb juvenile stuff, and while definitely earlier WWE in the 2000s and stuff was just vulgar and dumb for no good reason, I would also say it is fair to call the PG era like over sanitized. Felt fairly Saturday morning, and I do think there is a decent middle ground that can be found between like fucking poopy dick jokes and just a Saturday morning kids show. And I think that is the sweet spot that wrestling should hit, because then it makes it like a cool thing that kids can be like, whoa, this is like crazy grown up, and adults can be like, oh yeah, this scratches my child urge. It's gotta find the perfect balance. And that's also the time period when I like watched wrestling regularly. Like that's when I first got into wrestling as like a preteen. Fucking, CM Punk was my big dude. Drew McIntyre, much love, WWE champion. I had a John Cena shirt. Everybody loved John Cena at that time. The Nexus was badass. That's another thing about wrestling. Basically, after the NWO, every wrestling company tried to recreate its success with its own like invasion angle. Like WWE did it with the actual invasion angle, but then they also did it again in 2011 with the Nexus, who were like these dudes that were on the WWE run like game show, basically like wrestling game show, or not like a game show, but it like kind of like Survivor, I guess, but for wrestling, only in as much as you're voting off people and you're doing like mini games and stuff week to week, that kind of relation to Survivor, not like they're on a deserted island. But it was awesome. The Nexus was awesome. They should have let Wade Barrett win the WWE Championship and like kill John Cena. That would have been awesome. Like when John Cena quit the WWE and joined the Nexus and shit, that was awesome, and they should have stuck with it. And I'm pissed forever that they didn't. Then you have like the CM Punk rise to the championship and him being champion for like a whole year. And then I stopped watching wrestling. Brock Lesnar came back. He kind of has defined, I guess he's really been the face of the company since like, was it 2015 or something that he came back? Or no, I don't even remember when. But yeah, even only wrestling like 3 or 4 matches a year, he's like the most important dude still. And yeah, that's wrestling. That's all of wrestling. I hope that was very clearly understandable. You're welcome.